Welcome to the Leading Real Change podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jacqueline Kerr, an expert in workplace culture change. From my unique background in behavior science, public health, and community advocacy, I help corporate leaders with evidence-based individual, team, and organizational change to create thriving workplace cultures for all. In the Leading Real Change podcast, I interview dedicated and passionate change makers about their careers, how they lead change, and what leaders can do today to make a difference, to build healthy, inclusive workplace cultures for all. I'm excited to share these examples of real workplace change with you. You'll learn about effective strategies that are working and how to overcome real barriers to change that challenge us every day. I hope you'll feel inspired and more confident to keep leading change in your workplace. Please share this podcast with other HR, DEI, or ERG leaders who you know are working hard but are struggling to have an impact and need more support to effectively create a thriving workplace culture for all today.
My name is Uri Gneezy. I'm a professor of behavioral economics at UC San Diego. And a bit about my hobbies, I like to do stand-up paddleboarding in the ocean and walk around new places and just walk around cities and look at the people.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. I did actually get myself a paddleboard as well during COVID so that I got out more often. So we're both based in San Diego. And in fact, I was also a professor at UCSD, but that's one of the things I enjoyed reading in your book was how much you felt so privileged to be able to work on something that you love so much. So tell us a little bit about your career and how you got there.
So I got to be an economist just by chance. I didn't plan to be, but I was always interested in incentives because I think that incentives are what makes us do what we do. And even as a kid, I wondered, why do people do this? Why do I do many things, right? So in many cases, I don't even know, and you don't know why you're doing something. And trying to understand it, I think, is really fascinating. I found it fascinating before I started to study economics. And I was lucky that that's what some economists do. And that's how I got to what I'm doing now.
Great. And have you ever experienced burnout in your career or perhaps outside of work?
I'm 56. I'm doing this for many years now. And of course, you get at some point you have enough. I became quite good at writing papers, but keep doing the same thing is boring. And I think that's one of the reasons that I decided to write this book, because instead of corresponding with the 200 colleagues that I have that read the research papers, I thought that it could be, and it is, a real challenge to try and give people access to this kind of thinking and simplify things and make it such that normal people would hopefully find it interesting. So that's my solution for burnout, was to write this book.
That's so fascinating because actually that was a little bit one of the reasons when I was making my decision, which I probably didn't understand. As you say, we don't understand our decisions very well. But when I was making my decision to leave UCSD, I did think about the fact that, yes, I had great impact on my field, but as you say, it's a small number of scientists, and that I wish to have a greater impact in the world. And for me, that transition has been a huge challenge in terms of understanding social media and building an audience. And I think writing a book is somewhere in my future because, like you, I love to write, and I very much continue to write for colleagues in grant writing, but also in my own messaging and blogs. But it's a challenge to actually then to message this complex science in some ways too. And human behaviors are so complicated and we do misunderstand them so often. So I'm really fascinated by the fact that you have written this fantastic book and that it was very accessible. So tell folks the title of the book and a little bit about it.
The book is called Mixed Signals, How Incentives Really Work. And the idea behind the book is that every incentive that we see, that we give, that we create, also sends a message. It's not just say, let's focus on money. It's not just the money that you give, but it's also the message that comes with it about what's important for you. And I think that too often these signals, these messages are ignored. And what I'm trying to make clear in the book is that they shouldn't be. And if you ignore them, that's why in many cases incentives don't work. And if you understand them, the chance that your incentives will be more effective is higher.
And there was definitely an example in the book that I thought was very understandable, was the example of if you incentivize people to donate blood, that sometimes that can end up in having lower quality blood at the end, because some of the people that are doing it for a cash incentive may have different needs that they're trying to get that cash for, and therefore their blood might be tainted with drugs or something. So I thought that was really fascinating. And the two examples, when I came across your book, it was because it was posted with the example of incentivizing people to return to work. And also, I had a client who was talking about their company was incentivizing them as remote workers to go and live near head office. And so they were asking, is that what you want us to do? I thought we were allowed to be remote employees. Why are you incentivizing us to move nearer to head office? And head office went, oh, no, that wasn't what we meant at all. So often we do have these mismatched incentives. But yeah, it's been really interesting to me that some companies are incentivizing people to return to the office, even though there's many employees who really don't want to do that.
I think that many companies found out that it's really costly. If you ask everyone to come back to the office, many people are going to quit. I can give you my example. I used to go to work 5 days a week. If I ended up working at home, it would be with my laptop on the dining table. COVID came and I turned my garage into a man cave with a nice computer and TV and sofa and everything that I need. So why would I go to the office now? The only reason to go to the office is to meet my friends. And I think that many companies are gravitating more and more towards that, to have, I don't know, Thursday in the office in which everyone will come and we'll have a chance to socialize and to talk about things and have meetings face to face. But then most of the work will be done at home. I think that the workplace is going to change, has changed basically, and will not go back to what it used to be. And the faster companies will understand that, the better they'll do. And the example that you gave about incentivizing people to live close to home, I think is great because it exactly sends the message that is mixed. On one end, you tell your employees you don't need to come back to work, to the office. On the other end, you incentivize them. You don't tell them, you incentivize them to live close to the office. The employees understand that at some point you're going to ask them to come back to the office, and they might choose to leave now before this happens.
Exactly. And also then on the understanding of why these incentives are needed, it's because maybe not even that we're consciously doing this, but when we're weighing up our decision, we're comfortable at home. So basically the companies are trying to tip the scales to make it also exciting to go back to work, because the work itself and the environment itself is not what's drawing us back. Yes, our colleagues and socializing is drawing us back, but we don't need that every day. So then those incentivizing return to work are hoping that the added money will make the scales on the return to the office side seem more appealing. Whether it's working or not is, like you say, it's probably not working.
It's probably sending the wrong message also, because before that I went to work because I thought that's what I should do. Now you're offering me money to do it. My understanding would be, the signal that I hear is that it's probably bad for me to go to the office. So that's why you have to incentivize me to do that.
Right.
The better use of the money was to make work a more exciting place, that you go to work and there's something more exciting. Instead of giving people money, give nicer lunches over there, give whatever it is that would make the office more exciting to go to. That should be the direction if you want to spend money.
So that's such an important point, that if you are doing a cash incentive, the reason you're doing it is because there's a downside. And then what you're doing is alerting people to that downside. So I think that's so important. And again, in my mind, and I've interviewed, for example, Helen Cupp will be in this season of interviews, and she's written the book, The Future of Work. And essentially, she would argue, put the money into making a digital headquarters that is equally appealing as your Fifth Avenue office, because that's really where you want people to be able to be, is in a very comfortable digital head office. So that would be her.
It probably depends also on the kind of work you're doing, on your age. So I think that for younger people, it might be easier to make this adjustment. For older people that are more used to This kind of socializing, it might be harder. If your job is to work on your computer writing code, maybe it's less important for you to be around other people. But if your job is to have some kind of brainstorming or things like that, it might be easier and more important. So it really depends on the job and on what people want.
Yes, and there's a lot of debate around it because actually on the technology and coding side, there is definitely people that feel like they need mentoring in that type of job as well. And so sometimes they do want to be around other people because then they're learning by observing as well. So it's definitely hotly debated, but it's very interesting when someone tries to put their finger on the scales, what actually happens after that. So I have some examples here of situations that clients are struggling with, and we've been trying to think through them. So I would love to get your perspective on the behavioral economics of some of these situations, and also the situation of when incentives can work, and also then what are the sort of barriers to incentives. Because sometimes when you offer incentives, people think it's terrible and it's outrageous, and yet it might make sense in some ways. So I'm excited to get into these examples. But maybe, as we've both used the term behavioral economics, maybe you could also just define that a little more briefly so that people are aware what that actually means.
So different people have different definitions. Some people think about it as mistakes that people make, biases. That's not my direction. My direction is I very much like the traditional economics, the way of thinking, but they're making very strong assumptions. And as a behavioral economist, I don't make these assumptions. I look at what people do. So I don't assume how people are going to react to incentives. I go out, I test it in experiments or in the field. And I use this as an input. So I don't impose what people should do or what people will do. I just look and see what they actually do. And from that, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So the main message is that incentives work. We just don't always know how they work. So sometimes we can pay you money, like the example that you gave with going back to the office, and that will be counterproductive, that it will backfire such that people will be even less willing to go back to the office. So just trying to understand this without assuming things about people.
Right. And I come at it differently because I'm a behavior change scientist from public health. So we are also trying to see what encourages changes in behavior, either through habit formation or also the support that we can provide through peer support or through systems and policy changes. But sometimes I have worked with behavioral economists in the past. For example, when engagement was particularly low on an app, I won't name the app, but very well-known successful app, but essentially engagement was only there for about 30% of people after a certain amount of months. So then it was a collaboration with a behavioral economist to say, okay, how do we continue to incentivize engagement? That was an interesting one. And I know a lot of people do have these debates between whether we should be motivated internally or motivated externally. And essentially, I see it as both, because sometimes we do need those external motivations at first to get over various humps in our habit formation process. And then as we start to actually enjoy the behavior we're doing or feel benefits from it, then the internal kicks in. And some people say if you do the external motivation, then the internal never happens. But I haven't necessarily seen that in my work.
So a few comments about that. First, you can take a class in a business school. I work in a business school by an economist, and it will all be about people are rational and you'll give them more money or whatever the incentives that you're using, and they're more likely to do this job. And people go to work, people hate to go to work, they go to work just to make money. A class with a similar title by a psychologist will be all about the soft issues. So you go to work because you need fulfillment, because you need to express yourself and all the good things. Those are two very strong, none of them, of course, is true. What I'm trying to do is exactly what you said about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, to see how, instead of crowding out intrinsic motivation, how incentives or extrinsic motivation can actually crowd in your intrinsic motivation. So how can I use incentive to make you like what you're doing even more? And I think that's the big challenge. That's what we should try and do. About behavior change, much of a large part of the book and much of my work is about behavior change. And habit formation is one of them. Indeed, like you said, in many cases, just getting people to start doing something could really change the habit that they have. So many of your listeners will sympathize with the following, that I had periods in my life in which I enjoyed going to the gym. It was easy. I looked forward to it. And then I had periods in my life in which I couldn't get off the sofa. And the question is, why is it so different between different times? It's me, the same person, different times, very different behavior. And one of the things that we try to do is using incentives, for example, take students and pay them to go to the gym for a month. So we gave our students $100 if they visited the gym at UCSD for at least 8 times during the month. And then we stopped paying them and we wanted to see what's going to happen. And the crowding out assumption would be people got used to being paid. Now they're not going to go if you don't pay them. And the habit formation hypothesis would be that now that they got used to it, they're going to continue going to the gym. And that's what we found. We found that people that we paid to go to the gym were also more likely to do it after we stopped paying them. So we did find support for this. I think that's an important line of things that we can do with incentives, change people's habit in the way that they want to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's get into some of these workplace examples that I wanted to challenge you with. Loss aversion is something that I have come to understand from behavioral economics, which is that we tend to focus more on what we're going to lose than what we're going to gain. So somebody's going to be more motivated to not lose $1 that they've got in their hand than potentially gain $5, $10, $20 in the future. This is something that I have spoken with DEI program officers, and they are saying one of the biggest barriers that they have is when, for example, they're saying, okay, in this year, we're going to have a focus on, for example, the priorities of our Black ERG. And then they're saying that the biggest barriers that they face is from white employees saying that they don't think that's fair. So this is where then they're trying to spend time persuading those white employees that they've had unfair advantages all along. So they're just then trying to shift some of the same advantages onto the groups that haven't had those advantages all along. And so that's what I was wondering in terms of, is there an argument you can use to help people when they are facing employees who are focused on what they're going to lose? They're assuming that when somebody else gains something in the workplace, they're going to lose something in the workplace. Is there an argument that a leader could make to overcome that thinking? Or is there a totally different solution and workaround that doesn't address the problem head on, but does something else instead?
I think that both sides are right. So clearly white people, white men in particular, had the advantage for basically forever. And clearly now they're at disadvantage. So if we will see at UCSD, we're not allowed to do affirmative action, but I can tell you with certainty that we are going to do it. If we'll see a minority candidate versus a white man, we will choose the minority. And that's clearly unfair to white men. So there are strong arguments in both directions. Now, that's not part of my expertise. I study incentives, but I can understand both sides, and it's a very delicate issue. How do you increase the diversity in the workplace without hurting a group of people? So my son is in college now, second year, in 2 years he'll be out in the job market. I don't think that he should suffer because of all the bad things that happened before. I do think that having a more diverse workplace is extremely important. It's extremely important for fairness issues, and it's extremely important because the workplace is going to be a better place, right? It's a very complicated issue, and I don't have a solution. As someone who does incentives, I don't know what's the right thing. That's something that the society needs to come up with a decision. Management needs to decide what do they want to achieve and use this in order to build their strategy.
Okay. So in that situation, then you wouldn't necessarily say, okay, we need to incentivize hiring certain groups of people. The people that are feeling they're losing out on something, how do we address the other losses, that they're going to be losing their competitive edge? They're going to be losing customers if they don't have more diversity. Do we focus on another loss that is more present because they're already focused on, we already have this loss aversion, so they're already focused on their loss? Or in this situation, you wouldn't think about using incentives?
I don't think that it's about loss aversion over here. I think that diversity is a very important value that we should all pay attention to. And if companies don't do it, if companies discriminate, I would definitely not buy a product from a company that I think discriminate. It could be against minorities. It could be, my parents were Holocaust survivors. They saw discrimination at its worst. The US is built on very harsh history of discrimination against African Americans. There is still discrimination around. We should do the best and definitely punish companies that don't care about diversity, that discriminate in any way. From that to loss aversion, I don't see the exact line.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification then. So here's another situation in the workplace. We don't necessarily have paid parental leave in the US. So that's definitely one challenge that we have. But in some situations, there is paid parental leave where it's both for the mothers and the fathers. In other countries, there is definitely paid leave for the dads. And even as far as countries like Denmark, there is mandated paid leave for fathers. So they force the fathers to take the leave because we have such a stereotype against fathers being the caregiver and fathers taking the leave. So that's how far they've gone. But one of my recent guests was saying that the barriers that dads have for taking paternity leave, for example, say they wouldn't be eligible for a bonus that year. They're receiving negative comments from their colleagues, from politicians who speak out about these things as well. So there's the social negative side that they're experiencing, as well as potential financial and promotion opportunities. So the suggestion from one of these dads who works in this areas was to incentivize dads to take paternity leave. And then my response the first time I heard that was, you've got to be kidding me, because I felt we had COVID, we had this opportunity that dads could step up and do more in the homes, and that didn't necessarily happen. But as throughout the season, last season, I interviewed more and more dads, and I started to understand the struggles they're having with stepping up in the home, and that they don't have experience of being a solo dad. So the idea of taking leave and actually being responsible for the kids is something that they also don't have the confidence to do. So I got a lot more empathy for that situation and ended up feeling like the incentives might be something that would help dads to get over that hump. But then I think the response from people and other women like me was, that's ridiculous, that you're incentivizing the person who's had so much advantage already. Again, could you speak a little bit more about how you think this might work in this situation? Again, knowing that it's not your specific area of expertise.
No, yes, it's not. But something that bothers me a lot at UCSD, at any university that I know, is that the benefit that mother and the father receive is the same. So imagine my wife, she's also a faculty member. When she was pregnant, she got 1 year off her tenure clock, and I received exactly the same benefit, which doesn't make any sense because the technology is different. She carried the baby for 9 months, right? If nothing else, just because of that, right? So it should be differential. The fact that it's the same benefit for men and women is already discriminating, because the burden is much bigger for women to be pregnant, right? They should get a longer, say, time on their tenure clock relative to men. Now, about taking paternity leave, I don't understand the fathers that don't want to take it. I really enjoy the fact that I have a flexible job and I can take time whenever I wanted. I think that the Scandinavian countries that you mentioned, like Denmark, and I think it's in other places in the world, mostly in Northern Europe, I think, those laws came to place because they don't have enough kids and they try to encourage people to have more kids, and they try to give more and more benefits. One of the problems with longer maternity leave versus paternity leave is that the women are missing out. Those are the years in which you get advanced, you're productive, and get your career in place. And if you're going to miss too much of it, it's going to be a problem. And equalizing it, or somewhat equalizing it between men and women, makes a lot of sense. And the incentive, as far as I recall, in places like Denmark, is that if the father doesn't take the leave, or the partner, it could be 2 weeks, for example, if the partner doesn't take the leave, then the mother doesn't get it. So in order for the mother to receive X time, the partner has to take Y time. So some accounting of this, which I think that's a good example of a good incentive. If the partner doesn't take it, you cannot take it either. So we want to encourage you to be equal partners.
So that's in some ways almost the opposite of what this guest was suggesting, which was we should be paying the dads in particular to take leave.
They are paying. If you compare it to the US, I think that you get 6 weeks. I don't remember exactly, but it's a very short time. Some companies increased it to 3 months, some even to 6 months, but it's relatively short in most places. Over there, you get a year off. You get a very long time. That's a strong incentive because you can be with a child for longer if you want to, and you don't suffer in terms of financial suffering, at least. So there is already incentive. By giving you a longer paternity leave or maternity leave, you get an incentive already.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you for that one. Okay, vacation. This is something that we struggle with a lot here in the US, is that people are working during vacation, they're working during evenings, they're working during weekends. What are some of your thoughts about how we can change that? And is that a situation where incentivizing people to take vacations could work?
So I'm in a unique situation in which I can choose when to work. As a professor, I have to teach, but I don't teach a lot. And the rest of the time I do research. And for me, research, I mentioned that I enjoy walking around cities. That's when I do a lot of my work, because a lot of my work is thinking. How do I tell the story? How do I connect this? Thinking is a big part of what I'm doing, and it doesn't have to be near the computer answering email. And that also gives me much more flexibility. Many people don't have it. Now, you can think about people who work in places where someone is waiting for them. If you are a lawyer and there is a big case that is going on and you need to answer on time, it's going to be challenging for you to be offline for a long time, but it needs to be really reduced to the necessary amount of time that you do. It should be that once you get home, you stop working. And I think that no one is really effective 15 hours a day, especially not in works that need you to use your brain. Because if, our brain, if I have 2 good hours a day, that's a good day for me, right? The rest of the time, I do some other technical stuff that I need to do. But thinking you can't do it for that long. And I really think that vacations and shorter days at work are not going to be counterproductive. People thought that working from home is going to be really bad for productivity. It turns out it was wrong. And I think that the same is true for vacation and for time off. I don't think that we need to work that hard. I don't think if you can think about it as an inverted U. At the beginning, when you increase the effort, you also get higher productivity. At some point you peak, and then more effort, more time invested, it's really going to be counterproductive. And I think that the sooner workplaces will understand it, the better it will be. I think that working from home helped because if you need to take a break, you can take it. When you worked in a cubicle, you couldn't, because people would watch you. But if you need to go to your balcony with coffee, you can do it now without people watching you. And more generally, I think that we should understand and we should respect that this balance between work and life is important, not just because of well-being of the worker, but also because the workers will be more productive this way.
So that definitely is what the data is showing, and the 4-day week data show that. And again, the reason we have limited work weeks, although they're based more on manual labor, is because it does become unsafe when it goes over a certain amount of time. So we have all that information, but the mindset is work harder, work longer, and that's what you're rewarded for in terms of merit reviews. You have to have a stretch assignment, you have to do something more to get your promotions. So I'm trying to think through how behavioral economics can help us turn that upside down. How can we incentivize people to be working less because it's going to make them more productive? That's the benefit for the companies, but the mindset is the opposite of that. So in that sort of scenario, how can incentives work? How can we tip the balance more? Because even with the working from home, I agree it's more flexibility, but actually the work hours have increased. So it hasn't necessarily meant that we're being more productive for less time. In some situations, work hours have actually increased. There's been more emails, etc. We're not necessarily going in the right direction. Again, some things like the 4-day weeks is great when there's a policy that actually then prevents that. But many companies are saying, oh, that wouldn't be possible for them. So I'm trying to think of other ways that we can incentivize working fewer hours because it's better hours.
So if I would start a company now that needed people who can think, I would have made sure that people work from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5, and that's it. At 5, everyone goes home. And they reply to messages only if it's really crucial. If you need something for tomorrow because of something really crucial, you can do that. But in general, it's going to be really discouraged. And the reason I would do this when I start a company, again, not because of being a good person necessarily, as much as I believe that this way I will attract people that are now not willing to participate in this rat race. There are many people that are talented, but are not willing to do this. And it's mostly women. Women care about the family work balance more than men. That's what the data shows. And I would get better people to work for me if I'll say, look, when you're at work, you're working, say 9 to 5, 8 hours, you're working, that's what you do. After that, at 5 p.m., the pen falls and you can go home and do whatever it is that makes you happy. I think that this way you can attract better people to work for you. And these people are going to be more effective exactly because of the inverse U that I mentioned before. So the fact that you're absolutely right, that companies are demanding more and more, and if you want to become a partner in a law firm or in a consulting company, you have to work 60, 70, 80 hours a week. That's completely ridiculous. There is no evidence showing that you are more productive in this case. If you're billing by the hour, then you are, but that's a different story. In general, if I want good people to work for me, I would really make sure that they work for me 8 hours a day, and that's it, not an hour more. And that's, by the way, that's in my view, that's incentive, right? So to work in a company that says we are not going to work longer hours, that's an incentive. So incentive is definitely not just paying you money. It's also giving you the kind of work environment that more suitable for you.
So it's being very upfront and public about that from the start as a way to attract the people you want.
Exactly.
Yeah. The reduced hours is the incentive itself.
It is. And that way you'll get better people and these people will be more effective.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. So on to another challenge that some of my clients are trying to work with, which is companies are not necessarily setting targets for their DEI. They're also not necessarily collecting data on, for example, caregiver status. So caregiver status, like being a mom or a dad or caring for an elderly relative or a sick or disabled friend or relative, this is something that can intersect with many other identities, with gender, with race, etc. But it's not often collected in companies. And again, we can't support our caregivers if we don't understand that they're maybe missing out on promotions and the things that they're struggling with. And in fact, there's data from the stock market showing that companies who do collect this data and who do transparently share this data, that those types of companies are rated more highly on the stock market. Yet we're still in a situation where we're trying to convince companies to collect this sort of data. And even in the recent example, for example, having pay transparency, that became legislated, yet companies were also still refusing to do it. So I'm trying to think about situations like that, where we know having the data is important and necessary, that there's an advantage to having the data, but yet the fear of discrimination, lawsuits against you if you have the data, the fear that the data is going to show you're doing badly and you won't know what to do about it. I understand these are also the fears that companies have. So again, how do we tip the balance on these types of issues?
Pay transparency is a great example in which companies are afraid of doing it. And it comes to mind, pay transparency, mostly because of gender differences in pay. The argument is that men negotiate better than women. And the reason could be not just because men are more talented at negotiating. The reason could be that if I'm a 56-year-old man with a funny accent and gray hair, I will go and be aggressive. I'll be the man in the negotiation. And if you will go and do that, you will be looked at very differently. So for you and for me, we should adopt different negotiation styles because of the reaction that you get. you'll get some backlash, which I won't get. So the solution for this could be pay transparency. And that's the reason that it's pushed very strongly. And at UCSD, for example, we see it. At all the UC system, you can go online and see how much we earn. And I can assure you that all my colleagues, including myself, check to see where they are, because if there is a colleague of mine that earns more than me, despite of the fact that he or she are not better than me, that they are not better than me, then I will go and ask for a raise. Pay transparency is really important in order to reduce these kind of gaps. And it doesn't have to be just gender gap. It could be just that you're a great negotiator and you got more in the negotiation and I'm less good. So you're paid more despite of the fact that we are just as good at our job. So more information is clearly good. And exactly like you said, companies are afraid of more information because they're afraid that will expose them to, for example, litigation. They can find something wrong with this. They can find some kind of discrimination, or that no one will go and say, oh, why am I being paid so much more than her? This is unfair. It should reduce my salary. Mm-hmm. They're afraid that everything will push all salaries up, which could be the first time you see it, but after that, it's going to be much better for the organization. I think that collecting data about caregivers, about wage transparency, about anything is just good for companies, and they should not be so afraid of finding that something is wrong, because if something is wrong with what they're doing, they should fix it. Getting the data is a good idea.
So that's where I think there's so many of these situations with transparency in the data, with diversity, equity, inclusion. They're all good ideas, but yet we have such little progress on some of these things. So that's where I'm just trying to understand, how can we use behavioral economics to shift these things? Because yes, I would say policies would shift them. Yes, a CEO like you coming in, having a totally different way you're going to work and what you want to see, those things all work. But those seem too far away at the moment. I also agree that as a public health person, systems change is absolutely what I want to see. Policy change is what I want to see. But it feels like that we are in a situation, and this is like even the stages of change, of readiness to change. These people are not ready to change. They may be contemplating it, but they're seeing so many negative sides to doing these things. They're seeing so much pushback.
I understand why they push back. So if I push back because I think that women should stay home and they shouldn't be promoted in work, then you need a different policy than if I'm just afraid that the data will show something wrong. And as behavioral economists, we can, and there is a lot of work in behavioral economics actually that looks at the data and tell companies, look, that's not so bad. Look at companies that changed it, companies that had it, many of them because of new rules, new laws, and all your fears just didn't materialize. We can go back to working from home. Companies were extremely afraid of letting people work from home. It turns out that it's, in many cases, people are more productive when they work from home. So I think that giving data, supplying data to companies could help. If the problem is because they are afraid of something like that, if the problem is because they just think that women shouldn't be at the workplace, or any minority that you can think of, then that's where you need legislation. That's where you need the laws that will make sure that they don't discriminate. So you need the first step, and I talk about it in the book, the first step is to try and identify what's the problem. In this case, I mentioned two, there are probably more. And then once you understand it, you need to think about the tools that you need to use in order to change it. And if the reason is that people just have some kind of prejudice, then laws are important. If the reason is that they don't understand the impact and they're afraid of the uncertainty, then providing them data and information and showing them that it's not that bad could be really useful.
And I think we're also in that stage of doing that. There's more data coming through. Again, the 4-day week experiments have been helpful, right? They have provided data. So again, that's always my advice, is to do small experiments. Luckily, we had the big natural experiment of COVID and working from home to provide the evidence for that. But advocates and companies can start by doing small experiments to collect that type of data. But I'm feeling
that's true, by the way, for everything that you do. So when I talk about incentives, I always recommend to do some kind of A/B testing. So don't start by rolling out your incentive scheme to the entire population that you're interested in. Start with a small group, see what's the effect. In the incentive case, see how people try to game the incentives. You adjust them until you find what you want. And the same is true for any public policy that you have. Start with a small experiment like A/B testing, and then move on to a larger scale.
Because again, there are so many different ways that you can, for example, reward people. There's pay, there's percentages, but there's also various forms of recognition. So yeah, understanding that is really important because, as you say, it can backfire, especially if somebody's doing, say, a volunteer job in an organization because of the social signaling that presents them to be the type of person who cares about these issues, whether they're paid or not. I know that's a big motivation for many people working, for example, as an ERG leader. But at the same time, they then end up putting a lot of time and effort into these important roles that they have, and they're not then rewarded. And so they do end up burning out, which is in itself then a problem. I think I agree. We have to be careful about how we then, reward and these types of roles. But in this situation where we're collecting more data, and the data itself is not necessarily being persuasive. Because again, I have found that in my own work, and often I used to work in the Cal IT2 in the technical building there. And the head of that building would often say to me, oh, I've got this new tool to collect more data, and it's going to change how people perceive this, that, or the other. And I'd go, okay, keep collecting it. Come back to me when you see what happens. And of course, they'd come back to me and say, okay, the data's not changing people. And I'm like, because data doesn't change people all the time. Stories change people, or positive experience of something changes people. It isn't necessarily data. So in your situation, have you also come across that too, where the data itself is not persuasive? Because again, we understand risk very poorly, we understand numbers very poorly, and numbers are not like the human face of the data. So do you have any thoughts about how to complement data with other techniques?
When I talk about incentives in the book, I talk about how the incentive tell a story, right? So the way we think about the world, we take bits of information from different places and we build some kind of story in our head about what's going on. And the data, when it's used correctly, could also change the story that we're telling. Maybe I can give one example from the book. The CEO of Coca-Cola decided that on the regular price, if the regular price is say $1 on hot days, they will charge $1.50 on the vending machine for a soda can. So you buy a soda can, you go there on a regular day, it's going to be $1, but on a hot day, the soda can will cost $1.50. That makes a lot of economic sense, but of course, people were really upset by this. And the right thing that he should have done was to say that the regular price is $1.50, and on a cold day, we're going to give you a discount and charge you only $1 for this soda. So it's exactly the same incentives, exactly the same prices, but a very different story that you tell around it. And I think that the same is true for many of the things, like the data that you said, how you read the data and how you interpret it, you need to be able to control the story. Once you control the story, that gives you much more power.
Great. That's a fantastic example there. Thank you so much for this time and this fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I learned a lot in reading your book. And again, I hope companies are paying attention to thinking about carefully using incentives and careful about the story that they're conveying in their incentives. Is there anything else you'd like to end with, thinking about how we can shift some of these very challenging areas of society with behavioral economics?
I think that one important thing that we touched on with the working hours is that the workplace is built in a certain way, and in many cases, there is no good reason for it, apart from the fact that it was built by men, for men, I don't know, sometimes after World War II. And change is not necessarily bad. You should rethink everything that you do, and COVID told us a lot about that, and we can improve everything.
Thanks so much for listening today. I hope the podcast brings you fresh ideas, renewed confidence, and energy to keep leading change. If you need a partner in these efforts, I can help you effectively build a thriving workplace culture for all. I'll help you overcome the real barriers to change you face every day and help you lead real change with evidence-based solutions. In particular, I want to work with passionate leaders who have tried and failed, because I know you have what it takes, and your experience will help you clearly recognize the difference I can make. For a free consultation today, please visit my website at www.leading-real-change.com. That's www.leadingrealchange.com.
Take control, you're a fighter. Push the limits and see it, you're already there. Told you we going higher. Ain't no stopping us, we're going in for the win. And we're gonna celebrate. Then we're gonna do it all over again. And we're gonna rock this place, 'cause this is our day. We're gonna do it together, through any weather, rain, sleet, storm or hell. We're gonna prove it together, move it together. There's no option to fail. We're gonna do it together, through any weather, rain, sleet, storm or hell. We're gonna prove it together, move it together. There's no option to fail. Close your eyes, feel the power. Everything that you